All right, so when we think about reading a text historically and rhetorically, on one level, it almost seems to complicate things. Isn't reading just reading? Uh, One of the things that I'm struck by in terms of history teachers' education and preparation is this idea of sourcing. In other words, consider the source, know the circumstances that encourage the creation of that text, film, essay, book, painting. When we read a text rhetorically, and we'll let Chris deal with historically, and we'll see if there's a similarity or no, we're paying attention to what we call the rhetorical situation. Certainly we have to know who that speaker or writer is. We have to know who or what their audiences are. Often there is a primary intended audience, but also an unintended audience, maybe an audience that's farther away, maybe the larger public. We have the key subjects or targets of that argument. We also have the context or the circumstance that encourages the creation of said argument. So if we take, for example, an argument about what does it mean to be a feminist, that argument we have to pay attention to is who's writing it, who's the intended audience, how might that argument sound if it's produced in 1970 or 100 years earlier or even later. So when we read rhetorically, that's what we do. And I should also point out for the traditional English classroom that that's a much harder thing to do in the world of fiction. It's much easier to get those ideas when we read nonfiction, but we still can read a fictional text rhetorically, particularly when we think about those issues that I raised earlier, who the author is, how was he or she responding to their circumstance, and what their implied or explicit arguments are in their texts. So reading rhetorically.
So what you call the rhetorical situation overlaps perfectly with what in all three of the history subjects for the AP classes is called sourcing and situation. It's just paying attention to the historical context of what is being said, the intended audience, the purpose, and then what's called point of view, which is the identity of the author. Keeping in mind, an author can have multiple identities, some of which might be in tension with each other to the extent that students usually assume something about an author. Let's say a female author, there may be an assumption that this text is going to have a pro-feminist viewpoint, and that is not always the case. You have to obviously dig into the text and see what it says. So your comment reminds me of what we covered in the chapter on testimony and crosscurrents on feminism. So there's several examples in there. So the first one would become more from a sort of Western oriented view of feminism, of natural rights that come about during the Enlightenment in the 19th century, the push for property rights, custody rights, divorce rights, the vote. And then you can look at other texts where there's a Chinese woman who's challenging, but it's during the waning days of the Qing dynasty, a faltering dynasty, which of course is not interested in having further challenges to its authority by anyone, particularly a woman who's criticizing the government. A Japanese feminist who's undergoing a period of rapid change, modernization during the Meiji Restoration, but isn't necessarily a government that intends to liberate women. So these are different manifestations of feminism, but you can't fully understand the text unless you understand the historical situation and the identity of the author. So some versions of feminism are critical of the sort of Western-oriented version, which focuses on a set of issues, and those issues may be different in different situations for, let's say, women who are striving for access to, goods of family rather than just independence or material goods.
Would you say the historical situation is the same exact thing as the rhetorical situation? Just the only thing that's different is the years?
I think as I said, I think there's an overlap, but I think the historian is probably more situated toward coming up with sort of levels of context. So it might be to the foreground might be who's this person, which I think in the rhetorical situation is what you're mostly focused on. And then as you recede further in the background, it would be the context of the specific political environment, what's happening that's motivating this person to, in this example, critique the government. And then even going further, what are some global developments? And then even layering over that, what's happening economically, what's happening in terms of like social changes, what's happening diplomatically. Is this country at war? Is it having conflicts with its neighbors? And I think that enriches our understanding of not only what the person is saying, but how what they're saying is a reflection of the time period in which they're writing.
Yeah, I get that. In fact, in many ways, I'm thinking about music as you're writing about it. We can look at a piece of music just by itself and analyze and interpret that piece of music. But the way you're describing that stepping farther and farther back, we see a lot of that in the study of influences that create particular art. I want to back up a minute to when you're talking about the different examples in Chapter 5. In the English world, we call that synthesizing, where what you're doing is you're looking at different iterations, different examples, putting them together to form an original whole. And I think that is something that's very common in both the English and the history classroom, where if we're going to have an informed opinion about, in this case, feminism, we take an array of examples and we combine them to form an organic whole. Would you say the same thing is going on?
Right, and you still have to keep your eye on what your ultimate goal of the writing process is, at least for constructed responses, which is to formulate an argument. So the student is reminded that they need to put this together into a coherent whole and not go off on too much of a tangent, and try to use each one of these examples as a way to refine and make more complex their argument.
I wonder too if we can talk a little bit about sort of reading a text rhetorically or historically that's a little bit different. So Crosscurrents has focus on artwork, there's a satirical image, certainly data-driven charts. We even reference a film and discuss that film. So what does it mean to read a text that is not words rhetorically or historically? I'm thinking for myself, and that's why you can answer first.
Right. Well, I think it's like a toolkit. You have a set of tools. So let's say if you're looking at an image and a work of art, and an art historian is going to overlap with a straightforward historian in how they're going to analyze that image. But I think their focus is more on features of composition, light, shadow, those sorts of things, which of course a historian like somebody as myself would be interested in that as well. But I think the ultimate historical question is always, how does this reflect the time period in which it was created? What's the agenda of the person who created this document? Whether it's a political cartoon or a work of art, it involves features such as patronage. What's the agenda? What is this person trying to say about the topic? Right. Who is influencing, if anyone, the creation of this particular work of art? And I think that is always part of the historical inquiry process, is to ask that kind of question of linking the testimony with contextualization. And as you mentioned, comparison. So looking at, right, if you could look at artwork that's representative of a particular either geographic area or let's say artwork of the Protestant Reformation compared to the Catholic, right, Reformation or Counter-Reformation. Or in the case in Crosscurrents is looking at art that's from the period of the Song Dynasty with Chinese landscape paintings, and maybe they would unfold in a scroll and tell a story over a long period of time that reflects a particular view of nature, versus, let's say, Islamic art, which is going to be very different because it's, of course, driven by the importance of Islam and the Quran in that religion, and that offers some rich opportunities for comparing those two artistic traditions.
Right, and let's carry that a little farther. Let's say you immersed yourself in the artwork of Chapter 3 of Crosscurrents without knowing any of the contextualization, and so you're looking at, for example, depictions of holy figures in Chinese or Arabic art. I think one of the things that we then can do is, from that primary interaction with the text, then tease that out and say, okay, well, what does the Quran say about, for example, depictions of God or the Prophet? And then how does that relate to our initial interpretation? So I do think this gets back to one of our earlier conversations about how do we access knowledge, and there's no one way. I could read about the Song Dynasty and then look at the art that depicts that, or I can gain an appreciation for what I see in the art and then step back a little farther and read an additional source to find out more about that.